Father, I'll begin by asking you to give us your name and just tell us your full name, Father.
I am Jim Reuter of the Society of Jesus.
Arthur Francis Shea.
Bill Kreutz, Edmundo Martinez,
Francis X. Clark.
John Krebs,
Luigi Moigi,
Aten Andrew Bauer.
Miguel Anselmo Bernat.
My name is Honesto. My middle name is Chavez. And last name Pagana.
I'm Roque Angel Ferrios y Jamías.
Okay, Father, I'll begin by asking you to give us your name and just tell us your full name, Father.
I am Jim Reuter of the Society of Jesus, Director of the National Office of Mass Media for the Philippines.
Okay, Father, as you know, we're doing this documentary on the history of the Jesuits in the Philippines, and I thought it would be good to interview you since you've spent a lot of time here. So when did you first arrive in the Philippines, Father?
July the 4th, 1938, the boat docked in the Manila Harbor, 1938. That's right now, that's 60 years ago.
What were your first impressions of the country?
Oh, they were very, very good. Very, very good. I think the biggest impression was vitality. What I remember most are the eyes of the Filipinos, but especially one, Benny Javier, who afterwards left the society, but he writes to me to this day. He had big, lustrous, shiny eyes, a lot of vitality. And when I began philosophy, I was here for philosophy, in Sacred Heart Novitiate in Novaliches. And it struck me that the boys had a tremendous amount of vitality. The music was so strong. And at that time, Novaliches was bursting at the seams. We were living in a dormitory. The juniors and the philosophers were together, which the society is not supposed to do. But we didn't have enough room to do anything else. That big building that they have now for the juniorate was not yet built. So my first impression was vitality, vigor. And I was deeply impressed from the very beginning. And then I saw the Ateneo almost in the first 30 minutes that I was in the country. And the Ateneo impressed me also. That was the old Ateneo at Padre Faura.
Hey, Father, how did you get here in the first place? How did you get this assignment? Did you ask for it, or was it given to you?
No. These days, everybody's afraid to say anything that is pious or spiritual, but this is the way it happened. When I was 7 years old in grade 2, the nun was talking about the missions. She used to give morning talks, and we would encourage her to do that because the longer she talked, the less lessons we had. But she was talking about the missions, and that struck me as being attractive, so I began saying at the age of 7 that I would be a missionary. This is before I ever heard of the Society of Jesus and before I thought about the priesthood. And then later, when I graduated from grade school, I won a scholarship to St. Peter's Prep in Jersey City, and there I met the Jesuits for the first time. And when I entered the society, I took a little survey among those who entered with me, asking them, when did you know that you wanted to be a priest? The average age at which they knew they wanted to be a priest. These are the Americans in Wernersville, Pennsylvania. And we had 100 men in that novitiate. 100 men in the novitiate, 50 in every year. The average age at which they knew they wanted to be a priest was 7. 7. And then, when I was in 4th year juniorate, I volunteered for the missions. But that was not unusual because everybody volunteered for the missions. If you went to the Philippines, you were looked upon as honored, you know. Of the 400 young Jesuits in that house, 200 novices, no, it was 200 men, 100 novices and 100 juniors. The whole 200 volunteered for the missions. So when you were in 4th year juniorate, they would, in 2nd year juniorate, 4th year at Sacred Heart Novitiate, they would send 3 every year. That was the tradition at that time. And I volunteered, but when the list came out, I was number 8. So it looked like I was not going to go. But my father, who had objected to my entering because he wanted me to go to West Point, I was asking him to pray that I'd be sent to the missions, and finally he said, "All right, boy, you'll go, you'll certainly go, because I'm praying. And there's more joy in heaven over one sinner doing penance than over 99 just who need not penance." And then 6 of the 7 ahead of me, something happened to them, and that was very unusual because they were in good shape. They were young men, strong. But something happened to 6 of them, and I wound up as number 2 from Wernersville. Actually, 6 of us came together in 1938, 6 of us. 3 from St. Andrew on the Hudson. St. Andrew on the Hudson had more novices than we did. When I entered the society in 1934, there were more than 200 novices entered in that year. Wow. And right now they have a novitiate for both Maryland and New York, and as far as I know, Detroit, and there are 5 novices for the whole 3 provinces. But in my day, we had more than 200 men just for Maryland, New York. But everybody volunteered, and I volunteered also. And then I was sent in 1938.
How did you travel coming here, Father?
Boat, of course. There were no planes. In those days, there was no transatlantic flight. Boat. We came on the Empress of Russia from Vancouver. We went across the United States by train and then to Canada, Vancouver, and then we came by the boat, the Empress of Russia, which was sunk during World War II. And we came, through Honolulu, Japan. We stopped everywhere in Japan. We were in Tokyo. I met all the Jesuits whose articles I read later about when they were talking about the destruction of Japan. Black snow and leaping tigers. The snow coming down was black because of the oil, and the flame going from building to building, they were like leaping tigers. They were poetic even when they were destroyed. Germans, they were in Japan. And then I was in Zikaway, in Shanghai, stepping over the bodies because in those days there was war going on between China and Japan. And then Hong Kong, and then finally the Philippines. It took us more than a month.
Okay, Father, so when you first got here, what were some of your first impressions?
Well, at Novaliches, the men had just come down from Baguio, and they were living in the memory of Baguio. I didn't realize what Baguio was. I'd never seen it. But Novaliches was insufferably hot in those days. When we were walking around the cloisters after lunch, the habit would be plastered to your back with the sweat.
Excuse me, Father.
At Sacred Heart Novitiate, they had the novices, and they were secluded from the rest of us. But the juniors and the philosophers were together and living in a dormitory. But after lunch, when we were walking around the cloisters, the men were talking about Baguio because they had just come down from Villa. I didn't know what Baguio was. But I was so deeply impressed by their sense of romance. Guzman Rivas, who was a great man, he left the society later, but he had a magnificent sense of humor. But he was saying at night you come out on the veranda and you look down at the lights of the city. Well, in those days there was only one street, Session Road, and they only had one string of lights, which was kind of erratic. And he said it looks as if a string of pearls had broken in the mountains and the pearls had run down along the valley floor. And then Freddie Dincher, young American, he said, Baguio, It's the only place in the whole Philippines where you can see your breath in the morning. And then another young Filipino, he said, in Baguio they really try to be beautiful. In Baguio, when they put a trash can on a corner, they put flowers around it. And I didn't realize how much that meant to the men, because it was insufferably hot in Novaliches. When you walked around the cloisters, your habit was plastered to your back by the sweat. And in those days, we were wearing black. We were really wearing black. And when it was time for me to go up to Baguio for the first time, 1939, after exams, all of us were exhausted. And Tom Brady had malaria. He had an attack of malaria. Well, boy, we all had malaria. We were having blood smears every month. But Tom was lying in bed and his knees were up under his chin. He was having chills and fever. And when he had chills, the whole bed would rattle, the rack on which you put the mosquito net. And when he was having fever, when you put your hand on the blanket, it came away wet. He was sweating right through the blanket. And I said, Tom, we have to tell the superiors about this. You're going to die with this. And he said, no, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. If you tell them, they won't take me to Baguio. And so we brought him up to Baguio the next day. What I remember is we propped him up in a train, because we went up by Tudaban station and the railroad train to Demortis, and then up the Nagilian Trail. The same ticket that got you on the train got you onto the bus. And the big adventure on the bus was who would sight the first pine tree. But in the train, we propped Tom up in a corner because he was as white as a sheet. We thought he was going to die en route. And then we all sat forward so that nobody, if any superior came by, they wouldn't see Tom. And the superior did come by, and he said, is everything all right? And we said, oh yeah, everything's fine, hoping he would not see this corpse in the corner. But then when they found out that Tom had malaria in Baguio, they ran him down to Lourdes Hospital, which was there for 50 years. And when we visited Tom in the morning, he said, it's all right, it's okay. Even if I die in Baguio. But then the adventure of the Novaliches itself was beautiful, because we had such good men. Horacio de la Costa was in philosophy. See, his course was telescoped a little. He entered the same year as I did. No, he entered 1935, but he was summa cum laude from college, and so he only had 1 year of juniorate, and I think 1 year of philosophy, so that we came out even. We were born within 12 days of each other. But at the Christmas poetry contest, that's when he wrote, Juan de la Cruz hangs up a paper star, which I thought was beautiful. I do not think the three wise men were Persian kings at all. And then after a year, we were moved to Baguio. And for 2 years, we studied there in Baguio in what was called the Manila Hotel at that time, right opposite the City Hall. They didn't want to put us up in Mirador because somebody had objected that Mirador was not healthy for some reason. So we were living in the Baguio Hotel. And at that time, I was coaching St. Louis University high school team. That's where we got Joe Blanco. And that's where we got Luis Patin and Benny Mayo and Garospe, and about five men entered from St. Louis University, largely because of the basketball team. Coaching, the head coach was Rogelio Lao. Looks like everybody left the society. He left just before he was to be ordained. When the Japanese took us to Los Baños, that's when he left. But then I was coaching Henny Lopez, who is now the head of ABS-CBN, and Moralco and many other things, the Chronicle. I was coaching him at Maryknoll, he and his brother. And then I was moved to Regency at the Ateneo in 1941. And I directed my first play in the Philippines there. Actually, we did a couple of plays in Baguio, but maybe that doesn't count. But in the Ateneo, I directed Who Ride on White Horses. And of all things, we had Jerry Rojas in that cast, and Jerry Montemayor, and Johnny Tan, and Dick Puno, who later became Secretary of Justice, and Ramon Cabrera, who became a hero. Larry Henares, he was in my class. And teaching at the same time there was Raul Manglapos. He was still a student in law school. And the whole thing, the Ateneo impressed me. Manglapos was in an elocution, not an elocution contest, oratorical contest, which he won. But his strong sentence was, "After 400 years in the chains of Spain, when our fingers were just closing on the torch of liberty, came the Americans to tear it from our grasp." And everybody applauded. Oh boy, he got a standing ovation on that one. But his coach of all things was Joe Mulry, American, you know. So there was a lot of vitality in the Ateneo. I had a brilliant class. I had a really brilliant class. Jose Yulo, Mariano Laurel, Mon Ilanon, who later was head of Procter and Gamble, and the whole class was brilliant. The whole class, and J.V. Cruz, who applied to the Society of Jesus and was accepted, but they didn't take him because he was only 17. And then John Hurley, who was the superior, said to me, "You know, that kid is bright. He's the brightest we have, but my consultants say he's too young. He's only 17, so I'm glad he's still going to class." And I said, "No, he isn't. He was in my class, and he had stopped going to class for, I guess, about 3 weeks." And Hurley got white because if you know anything about John F. Hurley, the one thing he couldn't stand was lying. He was prefect of discipline. You could get away with murder, but you had to tell the truth when you murdered somebody. And he could not stand falsehood. No way. So then they did not take J.V. Cruz. And I anointed J.V. Cruz just a couple of, it seems to me a couple of weeks ago. He just died. But he died very, very well. Boy, I mean, the men that you taught when they were young, boy, those memories come back, you know. I never had any trouble with J.V. Cruz. A lot of other people have had. I haven't. Larry Henares, I have no trouble with Larry Henares. A lot of other Jesuits do, but I don't. When you've taught somebody, it's somehow that you get a relationship that stays forever. So then, in December of 1941 came the war. And that was the feast day of the Ateneo. We had bands playing in the yard. We had bunting all over the place. We were singing the Mass at the auditorium, the beautiful Henry Lee Irwin auditorium, when we got word that Pearl Harbor had been bombed, and then Clark Field had been bombed, and then Baguio had been bombed, and then the bombs began to fall on Manila. So all the boarders went home, and we were rationed from that day, from that first day. I was amazed at the vision of the Jesuits. They expected it. They expected it. And from that day, they rationed us. And then when the Americans threw open their bodega, and they gave away everything. Well, all the people going down there were killing each other at short range to get the turkeys and the hams and the beef and stuff like that. Our Jesuits, led by Mickey Keene, Father Keene, who was at that time prefect of discipline, he went down there with a truck, and he got only two things: barrels of wine, as much as that truck would carry, and then bags of flour, as much as that truck would carry. That's all he took, nothing else. He deliberately refused to touch anything else. And the result was that we had Mass every day from that war all the way up to the liberation. Well, and we were giving away flour, we were giving away wine, because from that first day, we were putting the wine into the chalice with an eyedropper. I forget now how many it was. It was something like 5 drops of wine you put in, and then you put the water in with an eyedropper, and you put in about 2 drops of water. It was something like that, 5 to 2. And the priests were saying Mass with small hosts. And when you got to communion, you got a piece of the host, that's all. But they knew that from the very beginning. And then the Ateneo became a source of it was refugee center, Padre Fowler. They took us at midnight on January the 1st, 1942. The Japanese had been outside all day. It was an open city. and no defense, absolutely no defense. When the Japanese bombed, the adventure was always the first couple of minutes. You know, well, I thought when they spoke of this, you know, of radar and so on, I thought that if we were going to be bombed, we would know it when the planes took off from Tokyo, you know. But oh boy, if ever the siren went off, that meant there was not going to be any raid. Whenever we did have a raid, it was always boom, da, boom, 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 and then about 2 minutes later, ow, because all they had were Boy Scouts up in the tower of the city hall looking for the planes. They never gave us any advance notice of a raid, never. But the adventure was only the first few minutes, because you would the whole city would shake whenever they began to bomb, so you never knew what they were going to hit. But they'd fly in a figure eight, and once you saw the planes, you knew what they were bombing, because they'd circle, boom, and then go back and circle, and boom, and it was always 5, 6, 7, 8 planes, so you could tell the target almost at once. And the Japanese were very careful with ammunition. I thought that they were gentlemanly in their bombing. They were going after military targets. There was a lot of oratory on the radio because they hit Santo Domingo Church. But Santo Domingo Church was only yards away from the Pasig River at that time, down in Intramuros. And they were after the shipping in the Pasig River. And they missed it. Now, they missed it by about 50 yards. All right, but that's a near miss. In a bombing, that's a near miss. And they hit Santo Domingo Church. So, they were getting oratorical over the radio, saying, the Japanese have said that they are only after military objectives. Was Santo Domingo Church a military objective? They said they were only firing against the armed forces. The bomb landed on the high altar and it smashed the statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Is the Blessed Virgin Mary a military objective? So but really, it was only a mistake. They were not trying to bomb the church. And then when the Japanese came in, we were prisoners of war for the next 3 years and 3 months. St. Scholastica's became a hospital for wounded Americans because that was German, and they were allies of the Japanese. We were listening at night to the voice of freedom from Corregidor. And at first it was Leon Maria Guerrero, but he finally lost heart because his family was in the city and he felt he couldn't do it anymore without endangering his family. He was summa cum laude from the Ateneo with Horacio de la Costa. And then it was Norman Reyes, both of whom I knew, because my assignment in Regency was teaching sophomore AB in the morning and writing for the radio in the afternoon. We had the Commonweal Hour, which was the strongest radio program in the Philippines at that time. We were on 2 hours on Sunday night, prime time, 7 to 8 in English, 8 to 9 in Tagalog. And our rating was 47. In those days, I don't think there was a very scientific method of getting a rating, but that's what they said. Of all the radio stations in the country, 47 were listening to us at any given time. And we had 47 on each. So, I mean, if you figure that one out, you know, if you had a different audience in English and a different audience in Tagalog, that means we had 94. We had a rating of 94. And then the newspapers would talk about those programs for the whole next week. And they really were the heart of the matter in those days. I'll tell you how strong it was. They were trying to introduce a bill for divorce. That's how Cuentong Cochero began. Horacio created Cuentong Cochero. And they were attacking it with laughter. They were attacking it with laughter. It was class legislation because they wanted to recognize divorce so a very prominent politician could come back with his new wife. And Quezon, after the thing had gone on for about 3 weeks, took the bill out of the Congress. He said there's no popular support for this. Quezon used to be coming around, it seemed to me, every other Friday to review the troops. He was used to see Father Joe Mulry. Father Joe Mulry was his good friend and counselor. And the Quezon's great, his great battle cry, "Young man, go to Mindanao," that came from old Joe Mulry. That was old Joe. And the men who went to Mindanao, they were Ateneo boys. Gaston, Emilio Gaston, he was one of the first. But we had many Ateneo boys going to Mindanao. And then they moved us from the Ateneo to the Paula's place in San Marcelino, what is now Adamson. And that was when Mickey Keene discovered the bayonets. They had 2 boxes of bayonets in the military school, which they had not declared. Now, there was no malice in that. They just didn't know they were there, that's all. But when Mickey Keene found them, the Japanese were enraged because the scholastics, the one that I remember most is Willie Nicholson, because the scholastics, all of us had it in for the Japanese. So when they were throwing us out of the Ateneo, what we were doing was we were taking the nozzles off the showers, we were taking the faucets off the sinks, we were taking all the electric light bulbs, we were taking all the doorknobs, we were taking everything that was movable because we wanted to make it as tough for the Japanese as we could. And when the Japanese found that out, they were white with anger. Sure, they were really enraged. So Mickey Keene was afraid to declare the bayonets at that time because he thought the Japanese would slam us all into Fort Santiago. So they put them on our cart, and then he covered it with bedding, and we pushed it to La Ignaciana on a cart from the Ateneo to La Ignaciana. And old Joe Mulry did not know that there was boxes of bayonets, and so he was sitting on them when the Japanese came to examine. And because Joe was sitting on the bayonets, they never even saw the bayonets. But Canali was the superior, Vince Canali, who later was provincial and then bishop. But Vince, when he knew about the bayonets, he got very nervous, and so he wrote a letter to Mickey Keene. Now, this is what Loyola said, be careful, scriptum on it, the writings remain. So he wrote a letter. It was a very simple little note saying, "Dear Father Keene, what shall we do with the bayonets?" Signed, Vincent Canali. And he gave it, of all things, to Jaime Neri. And Jaime Neri was picked up by the Japanese. And they got the letter. So in the meantime, while the Japanese were getting Jaime Neri and the letter, Vince Canali thought, well, the best thing to do is to get rid of these things. So at night, he went out into this river, the Pasig River, and I guess he had a little help, and they threw the bayonets into the Pasig, one by one, all over the Pasig. And so, when the Japanese knew that there were bayonets in La Ignaciana, they came and said, "Where are the bayonets?" And so Vince Canali said, "We threw them in the river." So what they did was to take the scholastics, one of whom was Freddie Escalaire, who later was a bishop, and they tied him around the waist and threw them in the river to dive for the bayonets. So they dove at night, but they didn't find one single bayonet. The mud at the bottom of the Pasig was, even at that time, 12 inches thick, so the bayonets would go right down to the bottom. They didn't find one, and the Japanese were so angry. And that's how so many got into Fort Santiago. That was the end of Joe Mulry. Joe Mulry went into Fort Santiago, and they took away his hearing aid, and he was sitting on the floor for about 3-4 weeks. And he developed ulcers, and then later died in the prison camp. We buried him in the prison camp in Los Baños. And then they took Vince Canali and put him in Fort Santiago. And later, when we saw Vince Canali in the hospital, oh boy, when he wanted to bless us, he couldn't lift his right hand. He had to take his right hand with his left in order to bless us. And when finally, and also Mickey Keene, when Joe Mulry was released from Fort Santiago, he walked from Fort Santiago to San Ignacio, which was in Intramuros. That was our old church there. And he was starving, of course, and they fed him. And then after supper, he was talking to the community, and he said, "Thomas à Kempis says, cellula continuata dulcescit. Your little cell, if you stay in it long enough, becomes sweet." He said, "I want to tell you, brothers, it's a damn lie, because that little cell never became sweet to him. But then they moved us to from the Puula's place, the third floor of what is now Adamson, to San Agustin. And there, we were on the top floor of San Agustin, and the Augustinians were very good to us. But then after a month, they put us in trucks and brought us to Santo Tomas just for one day. We were all on the floor of the gym. Then they brought us by train to Los Baños, and we were there for the last 8 months of the war. And that's where Joe Mulry died. He hemorrhaged, and we carried him down to the infirmary, and they couldn't tell what anybody had because they didn't have any medicines, didn't have any equipment. So the Dr. Nance, who was a surgeon, he operated, and Joe Mulry died on the operating table. After 5 minutes of the operation, Sister Isabel, who was working at Maryknoll Nun, she said, he's dead. And Nance couldn't believe it. He put his hand in through the incision and pumped the heart with his fingers, but it didn't work. So they prepared him, and then we brought him back to the chapel. Same crew that carried him down, carried him to the chapel. And he was buried the next morning. Shallow grave, because the graves began at 6 feet, but as the time went on, we got weaker and weaker because they were feeding us very little. We were getting 2 ounces of rice in the morning and 2 ounces of rice in the afternoon. So the graves got shallower and shallower. So the grave of Joe Mulry was very shallow. And then Joe really had 3 graves. They moved him from there. We were liberated by the 11th Airborne, which was very dramatic. And we went out of that camp over the barbed wire and the Amtraks. It was one of the most dramatic moves in the whole history of conflict and the whole history of wars. I mean, a lot of books have been written about it, because whenever a military operation comes off, they have exhaustive plans, like the Battle of Normandy. Plenty of plans. The plans, my lord, would take up about 3 rooms if you stretched them all out. And usually about 50% of it works and the other 50% doesn't work, and they think that's fine. But in Los Baños, everything worked. It was amazing. Everything worked. The planes pinned down the Japanese military in Mount Makiling, so they couldn't come down. They had a little army up there, but they could not come down to stop what was happening there because they were pinned down by the planes. And then the paratroopers dropped just south of the camp, and then the guerrilleros came in through the barbed wire. And all of our guards were killed in 11 minutes. And then the big Amtraks came up from Laguna de Bay right over the barbed wire, and we went out in the Amtraks with the barracks on fire. And that was the time that I realized what it was to have a country. Because here were these schoolboys, risking their lives for us, and they never saw us before. And so when we were going out in the Amtraks, I made a resolution. You remember some moments in your life that I would never change my citizenship. Because when I was a boy, I memorized a poem. Breathes there a man with soul so dead, he never to himself has said, this is my own, my native land. Well, I never breathed that way until that moment, but at that moment I did. So I resolved that I would not ask for Philippine citizenship because I didn't want to. Yeah, those days you had to stand before a judge and renounce allegiance to the United States. Well, boy, after the 11th Airborne, I couldn't do that. And once I did ask. That was under martial law. Under martial law, we were under house arrest. The military came into this compound, and 11 vehicles led by 6 colonels and majors. The first one into this office was Abadilla, who was the baby-faced killer of Marcos. And then we were under house arrest for 2 years. I was on trial in Crame for 12 days. And then my staff was so nervous. They were so scared. One nun was sent to Australia so that she would not be associated with me. And what they said to me was, well, it's all right with you because you're an American, and the worst they can do to you is deport you. But the rest of us, boy, they can put us in jail for life or shoot us dead. So then I thought, yeah, I'm really hiding behind this citizenship. So then I asked to be a Filipino, and they refused me because they said I was an undesirable alien. I was already under house arrest. But when on my 80th birthday in 1996, they voted in the House of Representatives and the Senate to give me honorary Filipino citizenship. So I guess at least I'm an honorary citizen at the moment. So for us, the war came to a dramatic climax with that dropping of the 11th Airborne. Then we were in Muntinlupa for 6 weeks because the war was still on and they were fighting off the Japanese from the walls. They were dropping supplies to us by plane. And then we were repatriated on a troop ship, the Eberly, and then I was ordained at Woodstock and did tertianship at Oryasville, and then came back. That was the time when I could have said, no, I don't want to come back. Some never came back. Some never did.
Why did you come back, Father?
Because it never dawned on me that I shouldn't come back. But also, the Filipinos are the most lovable people in the world. No, I always felt that my home was here rather than anywhere else. That thing that I felt when I was 7 years old of being a missionary, that stayed with me all the way through. Except now, I'm not a missionary anymore. I'm a charter member of the Philippine Province. And if you want to know what that means, you might think it's only a title, but it isn't. At one moment, when I was acting general manager of Radio Veritas, I went to Europe and I made a whole series of decisions for Radio Veritas because in my innocence I thought that's what you should do when you're general manager. But I did not realize that in the system of Cardinal Santos, nobody made any decisions except Cardinal Santos. Everybody else was an office boy. You never made a decision, never. So I did. I made a whole series of decisions with deadlines and everything else. And he was so upset that he said to Horacio, who was at that time the provincial, living in this house where I am now, Xavier House, he said, send him home. So Horacio thought about it, and then he came back and he said, I have difficulty doing that because he's home already. He's a charter member of the Philippine Province. He said, in order to send him home, I think I have to expel him from the society, but I don't have any grounds to do that. So that's how I stayed. If the others were sent home, by Artie Weiss was sent home by Cardinal Santos. He did something. Artie Weiss said or did something that made Cardinal Santos upset, and he was sent home. Hogan was silenced for 8 years by Cardinal Santos. So when Cardinal Santos turned on me, I might have been sent home surely, except that I was then a charter member. About 1954, when the Philippines became a province, it became a province with Frank Clark. Frank Clark was the first provincial. Then those of us who were here, we became charter members, mean the list of all the Jesuits who are here. We became members of the Philippine Province. That's it.
Can you tell us a little bit about why Father Hogan was silenced by Cardinal Santos?
Oh, yeah. Well, Walter Hogan, he was working with labor. Great man, Walter Hogan, boy. And very, very simple. Very, very simple all the time, from the beginning. He was the one who introduced me to Regency, sitting on top of the Ateneo in 1941. When I was coming into Regency, he was going home. So he was not here during the war. He was in Woodstock, Maryland. But he's the one who was telling me stories about teaching, And he loved the Ateneo so much, and he loved the boys so much. It was a beautiful introduction for me. What he said was, on his first day as as teacher, scholastic, he was trying to be very strict, and so he said, and now for homework, you will do this. And then he explained the homework, for about 15 minutes. And he said, are there any questions? And one boy put up his hand and said, Father, what is my homework? And he said, oh my God. The kid didn't even know what homework should be. But anyhow, Walter was working with the docks. He was working with mainly the Delgado brothers, and he was down on the pier a great deal of the time, and he was working with the real laborers on all fronts. And they recognized how good that was. He was running these first bishops' institutes for social action, BISA. And everybody honored Hogan, and he wrote the manifesto on labor, which all the bishops signed, in which they took great pride in presenting as their own. The name of Hogan doesn't appear there, but he is the one who composed it. Now the principles, there was no problem with the principles. But then there was a strike at UST, the University of Santo Tomas. Now, the strikers were lined up outside of UST. Walter went down there. He was not really marching. He wasn't holding a placard or anything, but he was there. And they felt that Walter was backing the strikers, which I think he was. And at the same time, there was some kind of a strike going on at San Miguel because the Soriano, Andres Soriano, the original, the old man, he was saying, you are my children. He was very paternal. And Walter Hogan was saying, no, we don't want you. You are not our father. You are our brother. And we want to sit at the same table and negotiate. But Soriano didn't want that. He was paternalistic. He really did give many things, but it was all concessions. It was not justice. And Walter Hogan was saying justice, now never mind charity. Charity is all right. We believe in that, but let's have justice first. And they wouldn't accept that. Neither UST nor San Miguel would accept it. And the Cardinal really blew his top, and he went to the provincial and said, don't see, if they want to get to a Jesuit, they can't attack him directly. They can't do that. They have to go through the provincial. So they did. And they said, do not allow him to speak on social action anymore. So that's what the provincial said to Walter Hogan. So his reaction was, I will not preach. I will not preach. If I can't preach on social action, I won't preach. So he never preached for 8 years. And then to kind of soften it, they sent him to Hong Kong, and he was floating around in many different ways. But that ban, as far as I know, I don't think he ever preached on social action anymore. I think that was the end of it. And me now, this is not necessarily true, but this is what I think. In his last days, Walter Hogan lost his power of speech. He couldn't talk anymore. I think that was the reaction to that silencing. Honestly, that's what I think. He was silenced for 8 years, and he couldn't preach. And I think that had such a psychological impact on him. It was a trauma that in his last years he couldn't talk at all. Now, they were trying to teach him to say a few words, but the most he ever got up to was about 17. He never could go beyond that. But he was silenced because when he wrote the principles, all the bishops agreed. But when it came to practice and put these things into action, boy, that's a different thing. That's a different thing. So the Cardinal Santos went after him for that reason. I think Cardinal Santos was genuine. It was like Bruno Torpigliani during martial law. He felt that he should defend the government, and Santos felt that he should defend the Dominicans. I think he went to UST himself.
What about you, Father? You mentioned that you also got into trouble during the martial law years. What did you do?
Well, I did many things. Well, in martial law, see, to start with, I was teaching first at the Ateneo de Naga in 1948 to 52, and then was shifted to the Ateneo de Manila, principally, I think, for dramatics, because I came up to do the play on Francis Xavier in 1952. And I was working in all of the extracurricular activities. I had dramatics and the Glee Club and debating, and was moderator of athletics, and we were winning championships in those days. And then in 1960, I was shifted to media, so that was the beginning of media as an apostolate in the Philippine Province, and it didn't have a name yet. That JESCOM came later. It was invented by Benito Ortoliani, in Japan years later. Jez Kamea. It began with Jez Kamea. And then with Jez Kamea came Jezcom Philippines. So I was working in media, and I was a good friend of Ferdinand Marcos. I mean, I was in Malacanang quite often because he had an idolatrous worship of media. See, he had a principle. He had a principle which was reality means nothing. What counts is the image. Now, I don't know how many others live by that, but I think the politicians, by and large, tend that way. Reality means nothing. What counts is the image. And he was creating reality constantly. So because I was very, very deep in media, and because, see, we got into TV right away. We were strong on radio, but when TV came up, everybody who went into TV came from radio. So I was probably the first dramatic producer on TV in the Philippines. We did Cyrano de Bergerac way back in about 1953, which was an amazing thing to do in the time because we had to do it live. See, it could not be recorded. And so when Marcos declared martial law, he declared it against mass media. There was nobody else to declare it against. The only one thing happened. I mean, those who are old enough to remember 1972, September. Only one thing happened. All the radio stations were closed down. All the TV channels were closed down. All the newspapers were closed down, except the ones that Marcos controlled. And the next day, he increased his rates by 400%. And then all of us had to jump through hoops to get back on the air. I was already working very, very strongly with the Philippine Federation of Catholic Broadcasters. At that time, we numbered about 24, 25 stations. We're now 47. But I was on TV constantly. We had many shows on TV, but all the channels were closed down, so everything stopped. So my own reaction to martial law was very, very strong because I could feel it when the schoolmen could not. The Ateneo couldn't feel it because he was not clamping down on the schools. He was coming in on media. And so I started right then, 1972, a little newspaper because it was what you call an alternative newspaper, the Communicator. And I was coming out every week with 10,000 copies. And it was very popular. And we were sending it to the provinces, and the provinces were multiplying it in what was called the Rural Mimeo Press. And then we had 25 blackboard newspapers, systems of blackboard newspapers. And one of them was run by Abrahina, who was killed for his blackboard newspaper. We had a martyr for this. And the real crisis came when one day a little nun, Franciscan, came to me and said, "The shoemaker is dead. Mang Adriano, the shoemaker, is dead." And he lived right opposite the sister's place on Legarda, right opposite what was then Loreto College and St. Anthony's Orphanage. And what happened to that shoemaker was 2 men came into his shop at about 5:15 and said, "You're wanted in Malacanang now." He said, "Well, gee, it's almost 6, could I not come tomorrow?" And they said, "No." So they marched him out of the shop. And at 6:25, 1 hour and 10 minutes later, his wife got a phone call saying, "Come and get the body." And when she got there was the shoemaker lying on a table, dead. And his trousers were soaked with urine. He had wounds on his forearms, and his head was bashed in. And the military said he must have had a fall. You take the body and you can bury it. So I sent reporters there from the Communicator, and the military said to each one of them, "Stay away from this. You're not going to find anything. Stay away from this." But then we discovered why The shoemaker had been summoned. He had built a little house. He was living over his shop in Lagarda, but he had built a little house in Quezon City. But he wanted to make some money on that before he moved into it, so he rented it out to 4 people. One of those to whom he rented it never paid him anything. And so finally he gave all of his tenants warning that he was going to take it over at Christmas time. And this tenant who never paid him said, "You can't drive me out because I have relatives in the military." He was a relative of Abadilla. And then we got the subpoena that was given to Mang Adriano, and it was signed by Abadilla. So I wrote this up in the Communicator. Now, the Jesuits who saw that, they said, "No, look, don't do that, because this is going to be the last thing you're going to write. I mean, you're going to shoot off your mouth this time, and you'll be quiet for the rest of your life." But I thought, boy, if I don't stand up for the shoemaker, who am I going to stand up for ever? You know, boy, if I don't stand up for this guy, boy, what I thought was, if Mang Adriano is not Christ our Lord, then is our preaching vain, and then is your faith also vain. If you're not going to stand up for this guy, who are you going to stand up for? So we published it. And wow, the reactions. He goes, "Well, life is very strange. Abadilla was an unusual character. He was a real killer. Boy, he was a killer like the world has never seen. He killed another cadet in the PMA in hazing when he was in the PMA. And he was bounced out of the PMA, Philippine Military Academy, and was reinstated by Ferdinand Marcos. And then when Marcos was planning that fake invasion so he could declare martial law, he was training Muslims for a fake invasion. And then when it was discovered, he wanted to liquidate the Muslims. Abadilla was in command. Abadilla liquidated those Muslims. He liquidated them. I forget how many there were, but it was a lot of them. And then his friend, who was an officer with him, said, "But boy, you can't do that." So he shot his friend. Oh, I mean, this Abadilla was an amazing killer. But he had deep devotion to his family. And when I wrote that article, it got to his mother and to his sisters, and they called him and said, "What are you doing?" And boy, that really upset him, you know, because his mother and his sisters had never said anything like that before. So they came into this, well, they were after everybody at once. They were after Benny Mayo also. They closed his Signs of the Times at the same time. And then they came in here, 11 vehicles filled with soldiers and 6 colonels and majors, and the lead man was Abadilla. He was a colonel at that time. So then my house was padlocked and for 2 years, and we were marked as enemies of the administration. The Communicator was closed down. It had run for 4 years. That was 1976. And then I was on trial in Crame. And the military, I had the expectation from the beginning they really weren't going to do anything, but they wanted to terrify you, you know, that's their method of doing it. So, but the way I got out of it, and this is interesting, was what I did was first I wrote to everybody on the face of the earth so that they knew what was going on. And when they gave me the charges against me, there were 76 charges. Some of them I had to look up in a dictionary. One was cabal. I didn't know what cabal was, but I found it in the dictionary. It means plotting secretly with other plotters against the legitimate authority. That's cabal. So I was charged with that. But then they gave me about a week to write a counter manifesto or something. You can write down what your defense. Well, boy, I wrote that defense and I got it out to all of the Catholic publications on the whole face of the earth, because by that time I was a good friend of Agnello and a few others in broadcasting, and so we got a lot of publicity. And then when my case came up in Crame, lo and behold, in came reporters with cameras and newspaper, and they were going around interviewing everybody. And boy, the judges got very nervous, because there are in a military trial you have about 6 judges sitting on a tribunal. You know, they're not just one. There's about 6. All of them are high-ranking. They're colonels and up. You know, and your prosecutors are also officers. And my defender of all things was the man who was later Secretary of Justice, Ordonez. And so, boy, that made them very nervous. So Johnny Ponce Enrile, who is my friend, he gave me amnesty. Now, amnesty does not mean what you think it does. Amnesty in English means we forgive you all your sins, but it doesn't mean that to the legal. They translate it into Latin, of all things. They translate amnesty, which is English, into Latin, which is noli prosequi. I am unwilling to prosecute you. So what it meant was, and they explained that to me, we know you're guilty, and we know you're guilty of these 76 charges, but we will not prosecute you on these 76 charges right now. We will put these in the file, and if you do one thing that we don't like, we're going to bring out those 76 charges, and we're going to put you in jail for the rest of your life or shoot you dead, you know. So that was it. It's the sword of Damocles. That's what amnesty is. So that stayed right up until EDSA. See, and then in EDSA, wow, that was the big one, because, see, this is not commonly known. I think it's more commonly known now than it was long ago. Marcos had all of our commercial media scared to death. They were really scared. Now, I can understand that, see, because the poor guys, if they stood up against the regime, they were going to, first their paper would be closed down, or their radio station would be closed down, and then all their workers starved to death. So what are they going to do? And then besides that, they'll take them and put them in jail. And Marcos had all power. He had all power. So it was just, for them, it was prudence, that's all. So they did not say anything about the slaughter of Ninoy Aquino. The only network that played that up was the Catholic Federation of Broadcasters, the Philippine Federation of Catholic Broadcasters, led by Radio Veritas. That's how Radio Veritas got its name. So when EDSA began, it was over the Philippine Federation of Catholic Broadcasters. It began with Radio Veritas, and they were so angry with Radio Veritas that broadcast was Saturday night, the Cardinals. On Sunday morning, they smashed the transmitters of Radio Veritas. They came in with clubs, literally, and beat the transmitters to death. And then the Cardinal called me and said, we need another transmitter. So we did. We got another one. I was working with my friends, because Johnny was my friend. Now suddenly Johnny and I became very close, and also Fidel Ramos. Fidel, very, very close. I mean, that was the beginning of a friendship. We've been friends ever since. Johnny Ponce Enrile was very, very close to the Philippine Federation of Catholic Broadcasters once he had broken with Marcos. But I could feel that coming. Every time I went to see him, Fidel Ramos was in his office. And he had helped me a number of times. That's the peculiar thing about the Philippines. You have to understand that. Deeper than anything else is friendship. It makes no difference about what position you have or what the law is. Forget it. See, so Johnny had helped me a number of times, like the Jacinto children. There were 4 little children. The eldest was only about 4 years old. Left here when the Jacintos were abroad and martial law was declared. And they were holding them as hostages. But I went to Johnny and said, look, for heaven's sakes, you can't keep those babies here. And Johnny said, yeah, we can't do that. So he signed it, and I put him on the plane. But he did things like that. He was very, very good. So then he needed us at that time. He needed us. So we had a unit inside the war room. We have 11 units anyhow, 11 VHF that connect with here, and then from here we go single sideband to all the other stations. And Johnny was saying, we've got to have a voice, because the people in the streets, if they don't hear anything, they get scared, they get lost. If they can hear a voice all the time, then they're happy. So we have to have a radio voice. We have to have a radio voice. Then we were feeding the embassy. I thought we were a backup, but we weren't. We were the main line. But with the embassy, it was a phone. It was a phone. And they left that phone open for 3 days. They stayed there. They didn't go home. They slept. They slept in the embassy. And the man talking to us was black. He was a man named Bruce. But boy, for 3 days they didn't hang up that phone. And so we were learning things from them, and they were learning things from us, because they would ask us a question, and we'd go to the radio and ask the war room, and the war room would give us the answer, and we'd give it to them. So that was how it was going, and nobody else was covering it. All the other radio stations, brother, they were playing music. So when Radio Veritas, when the transmitters were smashed, I was working with Ermita, who was an Ateneo boy, a very good Ateneo boy, General Ermita, and then Isleta, and then Colonel Ciron. I mean, he's now Colonel Ciron, but he was then Captain Ciron. And they had taken over Jacinto's radio station when Jacinto escaped. The government had taken it over, but it just happened that it was in the control of Johnny Ponce Enrile. So we took that station, and all day we moved the frequency closer and closer to 846. See, it's fairly close. It's 810, but we moved it from 810 to 846, so that when finally it came in as Radio Bandido, they thought it was the same transmitters, and the helicopters were looking for that. They went back and they shelled Radio Veritas again, because they thought that somehow they got the things going, and they threw shells at it. But it wasn't there. And they never found DZRJ, because it's right on top of Malacanang, and they couldn't triangulate. At least that's what they say. I mean, but Ciron says, no, it was a miracle. He said, they should have found it, but they never did. If they had found it, boy, we would have been dead. But they didn't find it. They didn't. So we were carrying the news. The Philippine Federation of Catholic Broadcasters, not only in the city, but all over the country. See, and that gave us stability. I mean, all of those stations where, they were keeping the people abreast of what was going on. And it was magnificent, really. And June Keithley, was in that chair when she was supposed to be handling the telefax in our office, but then Christian Mansud, who was in charge of the quick count, who was doing that, what did you call that? Namfrel. He was in charge. He said, no, you can't have that telefax, because that links you with Aquino. And we're not supposed to be one-sided. We're supposed to be neutral, see, because that was our pitch when that's how we stayed on the air, that we were neutral. So he said, you can't use that telefax. So I was using June for that. So I said, June, well, look, you're a performer, so you be our link with Radio Veritas. We'll give you a mobile unit, and then you go there, and we'll feed you, and then you announce over Radio Veritas. So she did. And then, when we lost Radio Veritas, then she moved to Radio Bandido, and then she was the only one, because none of the Radio Veritas staff would come with her. Which probably was good, because they went out there to Fairview. If they had found anybody on the air, they might have killed them all. They might have, And so at least we didn't have deaths. That was pretty good. So and so June was broadcasting from Radio Bandido, DZRJ, until finally Marcos took off, and that's how I got into trouble originally with the communicator press, but it was all media.
Father, you've been, in all your years here, you've been involved in many apostolates, teaching, dramatic,
yes,
media. Could you cite some instances when you felt that you felt most like a Jesuit, doing the work that is meant to be done by a Jesuit, Father?
Well, no, I think, this is weird, but I think that all of the work that I've been trying to do is certainly what the Society of Jesus wants to do. See, if you start with media, our purpose is communication, really. In the schools, that's our purpose. In the retreats, that's our purpose. In the missions, that's our purpose. In social work, that's our purpose. So it seemed to me, whenever I was directing a play, either on stage or on radio or on TV, I felt that, boy, this is an apostolate. It never dawned on me that it was not. Because everybody else works for money and we don't. I mean, all of it. We know what we're trying to do. We're trying to deliver a message. We're trying to say something. We're trying to be a channel between God and man. And it's all of my work, at least most of it anyhow, has been media. In the schools, you're working with boys. Now there, you're developing boys. Now that I understood very, very simply. And even in athletics, see, what is the purpose of a school, of a boys' school? It's to make a man out of a boy. Well, what's the virtue of a man? It's courage. But there's no course called courage. There's no mark called courage. I mean, where do you develop courage? Well, you get that in sports. I mean, sports, I've always believed in them from the beginning to the end. So the Glee Club, what are we doing? We're developing boys. That's it. We're developing boys. And I don't know. I guess I would feel closest to God with retreat work especially. And your retreat work, see, it starts with face-to-face giving a retreat. That's the first one. But if you are on TV, it's also face-to-face. You're doing exactly the same thing, except that now you're speaking to more people and people whom you do not see. And if you're on radio, you're doing exactly the same thing. So I have never felt that I was wandering away from the path that Loyola would have chosen, because I think that if Loyola was working in Manila, boy, he'd work on media. I think that he would. I think that's the strongest educational force in our world is media. It is.
Father, you've spent a lot of years here. You've done a lot of work, even serving the local church, for example. You're very prominent serving bishops. Could you name one or two instances when you felt that you felt very much rewarded in your work, and you felt that this must be a sign that you're doing the right thing? That there are moments like that in our peak moments in our life when we feel this is a good thing that I'm doing. I'm doing the right thing for God. Can you maybe relate a couple of instances when you felt that way, felt strongly that way?
Yeah. The most recent, I think, was 7 decades of sin. 7 decades of sin, because cardinal sin has really done many good things, many good things. And he really has been heroic in many ways and has been very close to God in many ways, which have been lost which are not appreciated. And when you put them vividly on the stage, you feel that you're honoring somebody who really should be honored, that you're giving credit where credit is really due. So that I felt that. Even I got into trouble a little bit with that play also, because they felt that we should have been gentler with the nuncio and with Rome. But we were presenting exactly what the nuncio did and exactly what Rome did. And we defended it also. We said, well, Rome has to do that. They're a state. They have to stand by the state. That is, no state comes in for the revolutionaries. And that's what sin was. He was a revolutionary. And the nuncio had to come in on the side of the state. He was the head of the diplomatic corps. So I thought that I thought then I was telling the truth. The other thing that I thought was, what I felt very, very good about was that documentary we did on EDSA. I thought, boy, we are here telling the truth, and it's not easy to tell the truth. It's not easy to get the truth through. And I think we did. I think we did get it through. I guess you feel most... oh, boy, well, wait. There's one thing, yes, where you, now in answer to your question, is there any moment when you feel, yes, you have done this? Confessions. Confessions, that's it. in confession, boy, that's when you feel you really have, you really are doing what God wants you to do and what the society wants you to do. The confession's probably more than anything else, more than anything else. And then I would think also in preparation for the sacraments, when you try to prepare a boy and a girl for their wedding, because boy, that's the crisis of our world, it's marriage. Ugh, that's what the United States said in Bucharest in 1990. The problem facing the United States is the breakup of the American family, the dissolution of morals among the young, and the breakup of the American family. So that when you are trying to train to talk to a boy and a girl who are about to get married, and it's an ideal situation because they're in love with each other and they agree with everything that's in the gospel, 100%. Their problems come later, but they accept the truth so beautifully. So I would guess confession, yeah, that's first. And then secondly, I would say preparation for the sacraments. Preparation for the sacraments. I guess I also felt that way many times. I guess when I spoke to Fritz Araneta, who was my friend, and said, "What about coming back?" Well, the first time he said no. Right away he said no. But then I discovered later that he said to his family, "I am not worthy." That's what he said, "I am not worthy." Well, gee, Kolvenbach had said if he wants to come back, we'll take him, you know. So, I mean, no matter what Fritz thinks, the society is willing to take him back. So, and so I think that's kind of, and it's whenever you do something for anybody that looks as if you're not getting anything back, that's when you feel most like a priest. When you feel this guy is taking advantage of me, you know, I'm doing things for him and he's not giving anything back. Well, somehow that's the moment that you get most, that you get back most, is when you feel that you're giving. I felt that, I think whenever you work in any form of media, you feel that you're doing what a priest ought to do. See, that book that I tried to write on George Willman, that seemed to me, boy, that's a work of the society. Because, boy, our big men, they live and die and are forgotten. That's it. Horacio de la Costa, there is no book on Horacio de la Costa. There's no book on old Joe Mulry. There's no book on John P. Delaney. Boy, you know, the big men. There's no book on Benny Masterson. You know, boy, they name a building after him, and after 5 years, people say, "Who was Masterson?" You know, they have no concept who Masterson was. So that, no, I have felt that way a number of times. With the bishops, I think most when I'm under fire for things that they have said. See, for instance, the stand that the bishops took on the elections, you know, because they said, we are not going to campaign against anybody because of religion. I mean, if a man is a Protestant, we will never say, do not vote for that man because he's a Protestant. No way will we ever do that. Nor will we back any political parties. You know, everybody presumes that the Catholic Church is a political institution, you know, and that if the candidate that they think the Catholic Church is backing doesn't win, all right, it's a defeat of the Catholic Church. But the Catholic Church has no candidate. So whenever I'm doing that, whenever I'm speaking, whenever I was spokesman for the bishops for about 10 years, but whenever I spoke for the bishops, I felt this was really what you should do. I felt that. I felt close to God in those moments.
Father, in the course of the interview and also just a few minutes ago, you mentioned some of the great Jesuits who were here.
Yeah.
Among them, who would you say had the greatest and deepest influence on you in your formation?
Oh, walking away, Ernest P. Hartnett of the Society of Jesus. Boy. And nobody even remembers Ernie. When I went to St. Peter's Prep in Jersey City in the year 1930, he was a scholastic. and he was in charge of the school magazine. And then later he was in charge of dramatics, and then he was in charge of debating. And he had a deeper impact on me than anybody else. At that time, I mean, boys make decisions with their eyes and ears. I had been saying since I was 7 that I would like to be a missionary, but about the time I was 10, my father said, "No, that's nonsense, stop saying that," so I stopped saying it. But in high school, so now it seemed like a new deal altogether. But when I looked around, there was nobody that I wanted to be like, really wanted to be like, except Ernest Hartnett. Boy, he really had an impact on me. He was so kind. He I never heard him say a negative word. I never heard him say a negative word. When he published the first article that I ever had printed was in the Patrian, I think they called it. It was the monthly magazine of the high school. He was talking to me as if we were co-editors, you know. Boy, oh boy. Well, the article, of course, was not the best in the world, but he was so positive. And then in debating, he would never say, "This is no good." He'd always say, "No, this part, this is really good. Maybe we should amplify that. Now, when we make that bigger, we have to take something out. Well, maybe we could take this out." And then he would take out the weak parts and then emphasize the strong. But he was that way all the time. And one night, when we were coming out of drama, it was about 10 o'clock at night. We'd been rehearsing, and I was heading for the train because I lived in another city. And he said, "What time is your train?" Oh boy, I mean, just that he should remember that I didn't come from Jersey City was something. So I looked it up, and I said, "It's at 11:15. He said, "Oh, no, look, you don't want to sit for an hour in that cold station." And he took me over to the convento and then gave me hot cocoa and cookies. And then I went and got the train, you know. But boy, I was so impressed by that. And then when I came back early in the morning to get my books, because I was going to do my homework early in the school, he came down with a series of articles for the debate that we were working on, marked. And he had done that sometime between the moment I left him and the moment I saw him in the morning. So I was fiercely impressed by Ernie. Then when I came to the Philippines, he came here. And he was down in Culian for a while. And oh boy, he was really a priest. One of the stories that he told, it's the only time I ever saw him upset. He said a young man went down to Culian. I had lived in Culian for 6 weeks also, with, of all things, Father Joaquin Villalonga. Boy, history, boy, what Villalonga opens the door on that whole vista of Del Pilar and Rizal and everybody else. He was on the roof when Rizal was marched down to be executed. But Ernie was in Culian in the leper colony, and a young Jesuit came down, priest, and he had ideas of becoming a missionary to the lepers. But when he saw the lepers, he got physically sick. Now that happens to some people. Even Robert Louis Stevenson, who was a tough sailor, when he saw his first lepers, he got physically sick. He threw up. Well, this young Jesuit was scared. He was just scared. When he saw the lepers, he could not operate. You know, he was paralyzed. So he couldn't get out of the place because the boat only came back in 2 weeks. So he was there in the convento for 2 weeks. And when Ernie was out and the pastor was out, whoever the pastor was at that time, a call came from the hospital saying, "There's a leper dying, could you come and anoint him?" And this young Jesuit who was there, he wanted to go. He really wanted to go, but he couldn't get himself out of the door. And then when Ernie came back, he told him there was a phone call. So Ernie ran from the house, our house, to the hospital. Now, if you've been down there, you know how long that is. It's about a mile. But Ernie ran the whole mile. But when he got there, the poor old man was dead. But Ernie was that way. But then, and he was working with George Willman for a while. He was working with George Willman. I do not know what happened. I don't know what happened to Ernie. I think he was too sensitive for this world. I think it was that. He was too idealistic for this world, I think. He became a recluse. No, I don't know. I don't know whether that's the best way to say it. Some would say somehow his mind broke. He never did anything erratic. He just hid from men. He would not. They put him in Monroe, which is for our sick people. He would not even come to meals. He wouldn't see guests when they came. He was always disappearing around a corner. And he was that way for about 40 years. And always I wanted to write to him and tell him how much he had meant to me, and I never did. And only about 6 months ago, the sign went up on the board that Ernie was dead. But Ernie had a deeper impact on me than anybody else. Anybody else. Now after that, Horacio de la Costa probably, because we worked at close range. Old Joe Mulvey, boy. And I would guess, and John P. Delaney, I knew all of them rather well, but de la Costa closest. Mulvey next, I would guess. And Walter Hogan, of course. I know we had some great men. Hernando Maceda from this house. Hernando was a saint. No, I think that I should not say one more than the other, because you put them all together, it's like a stained glass window, you know. But Villalonga, he had a deep impact on me also. He was a crusty old Spaniard. And I was superior at Culion because Villalonga, he had been provincial and many big things, and so in his old age he was going in for humility, and so he would never be a superior, which was ridiculous because he knew more about the place than anybody else. So there I was superior, and I'd never seen the place. And the superior who was there at that time was sick, and he was taking off. So when I arrived in the boat, he got on the same boat, and he said, "Carry on, boy, carry on." So I didn't know what to do, you know. And then I had Luis Patin there, whom I had coached when he was in high school, and he was a brother. And so at breakfast, I was trying to get information from Luis. What do we do here? Where do we go? How do we do it? And Joaquin Villalonga went by, and he saw us talking. And he said in Latin, "Pater generalis dixit mihi, Deo gratias apud gentaculum numquam." Father General said to me, "Talking at breakfast? Never!" So he was not superior, but he scolded me every time I turned around. But when he was talking, my Lord, he was on the roof when they marched Rizal down to be shot. And when the Americans when Dewey sailed into Manila Bay, the night before, Montojo, who was in charge of the Spanish fleet, came to San Ignacio to go to confession, because he used to carry the baldacchina in the procession. Montojo with the mustaches, you know. You see his picture, he's a famous character. And when he was leaving after his confession, the community, including Villalonga, stopped him and said, "What are our chances for tomorrow?" And Montojo said, "None." He said, "We are going through the motions." And that's all it was. And then Villalonga said, "I had a boy in my class. He was bright. He was very bright. And he was a good boy. But he didn't finish. He dropped out. He dropped out to join the revolution." That was Gregorio del Pilar. Gregorio del Pilar never graduated from college. Imagine that. And he's the one who died above the clouds, you know, holding back the whole American army for a full day. So, and I said to Villalonga, "You should write your remembrances." And he said, "If I wrote, you Americans would not like what I write." You know, that's what he said. He had it in for the Americans because he was procurator and he had bought land in Manila. And when the Americans came, they thought it was not worth much, so they sold it for a song. It is now the central market. And but Villalonga was a good man. He was a very good man. And then many others. Old Joe Mullery, the way he died, oh boy, that touched me. Heine Greer gave him 3 cigarettes. Cigarettes were very precious in those days. And Joe said, "Oh, I wouldn't need that many." That's what he said. I think he knew that he was going to die. And he died about half an hour later.
Excuse me, Father. Father, after all these years in the Philippines, what do you think has been one or two areas where the Jesuits have been able to make some kind of contribution?
Oh, the Jesuits have made a tremendous contribution. The way I see it, anyhow, it's man to man, person to person. I mean, that's where I see the contribution. I'm thinking first, for instance, of old Joe Mulry. Now, the impact that he had on a man like Sac Rodrigo, or on Raul Manglapus, or on Jess Paredes, they not only worshipped the ground he walked on, but they lived by his principles all the way through. Bert Avellana, these guys who were men of the world in many ways, but the principles that were given to them by Joe Mulry, wow, they treasured them until they died. And even a man like Edgar Martin. See, I think it's always that way, 1-to-1. Edgar Martin was finding athletes in the city streets. He'd pick them up out of the gutter. And one of the athletes that he picked up out of the gutter was Tiny Litoral. Litoral and Ballesteros he got at the same time. Now, the scholars in the Ateneo in those days, for instance, led by Nick Kunkel, who was the dean, they wanted those people out. Well, they've gotten them out since. Now they have no more athletes left. But they wanted Ballesteros, and they wanted... Ed picked up athletes who never would have gotten to the Ateneo if Ed had not found them. And one example is Tiny Litoral. And the scholars were always saying he should be bounced out of the school. But Ed would try to help them with their lessons. He would help them with everything. He'd campaign for them among the teachers and so on. And his heart really went out to those boys. He understood them. And then Litoral eventually graduated. He actually graduated from the Ateneo. And some years ago, I was giving a retreat in Baguio, and they introduced to me a girl, a tall girl, good-looking, a beautiful girl. And she said, "My name is Litoral." And I said, "Are you any relation to Tiny?" She said, "He is my father." He had 2 daughters in Assumption. And they both were beautiful, and that amazed me because they did look like Tiny Litoral, and he's as homely as sin, But the girls who look like him, they're beautiful. And then Tiny Litoral was his devotion to Ed Martin all the way through. He was finally working with customs, and whenever Ed came in on a plane, Tiny would wait for him to make sure that he had no trouble getting through. And once Ed was late. Fiercely late, about 5 hours. Tiny Litoral waited patiently in that airport for 5 hours till Ed came. And then later, when Ed died, I met Tiny in the airport, and he said, my son's going to the Ateneo. He said, my son's on a scholarship. He said, "You know what scholarship it is? It's the Ed Martin Scholarship. There's an Edgar Martin Scholarship for basketball in the Ateneo High School." And Tiny Litoral's son had won it and was going to school because of that scholarship. He said, "Father Martin is helping me even from the grave." That's what he said. Now, that's my concept of the impact that we have had. It's person to person. The people who were close to John P. Delaney, wow, the impact that he had on those men. Woo. And just my own boys that I've known from the Glee Club and I've known from dramatics and everything else, they remember it's the impact on the person. I don't think you make a sweeping impact on an institution, or if we do, I'm not too aware of that. I mean, we have in some ways. For instance, Jimmy Martin, the great Jimmy Martin, whom you would not even remember. Jimmy Martin was only here for 3 years, but he was the basketball coach of the Ateneo, the team that made the Olympics and did better in the Olympics than any other team has ever done. The captain was Ambrosio Padilla, and he had the Martinez brothers as guards. He had Charlie Horse Bork on his team. But the way Ambrosio Padilla, who was a leader of men. The way he remembered Jimmy Martin. Oh boy, the impact of the scholastic on these men. The way they remember Dennis Lynch. Even the way they remember Pete Vercellus. I'm supposed to talk for Pete on Thursday, and I don't know what to say. But I met a family, and they were so devoted to Pete, and laughing because he used to officiate the masses for their family. And once when he was doing their 25th, their silver jubilee, there's 13 children, but he was saying the mass for the silver jubilee of the daddy and mommy. I guess he was the priest who married them 25 years ago. And somehow he got mixed up. Pete was getting mixed up in his later years. And it should have been Ben and Julie, but he somehow got the idea it was Meldy. So he was saying Ben and Meldy all through the Mass. And so all of the people in the church, they were putting handkerchiefs in their mouth to keep from laughing, but they were so devoted to Pete. And I think that's the kind of impact we have had. See, no matter where we are, I think it's really the impact of the gospel, but it's somebody carrying the gospel not only by what he says, but by what he does and by what he is. See, like Tony Mercado, who is a tremendous figure at the moment in business. I mean, he's the founder of Basic Advertising. Well, his idol is Artie Shea. See, Artie Shea, oh boy, Balingasag, that's where he grew up in Mindanao, and boy, his memories of Artie Shea. And Artie Shea was so defensive of Tony Mercado. Tony never got a diploma from the Ateneo. Somehow he was bounced out for something that he did. Well, Artie was so upset by that. Wow. But it's the devotion of it's man to man. I think the bridge ultimately comes that way. And I think, we've made a tremendous impact. In Naga, for instance, all of the rulers of men, all of the politicians come from the Ateneo de Naga. That's it. All the mayors, all the congressmen, they all come from the Ateneo. And the same way here. They remember professors, or they remember the missionary in the church, or they remember somebody like Ed Martin, who was a moderator of athletics. I think that's our greatest impact. It's man to man.
Father, given our history in the Philippines, what are your own dreams for the society here?
I have two. One is, I do not think that we should give up any of our traditional ministries. The way signs are going up on the board, it always sounds like we have to scuttle something. What are we going to scuttle? Well, I would be very reluctant to give up the missions that we have in Mindanao. Now, I understand the principle that if other priests can do it, let them do it, and if they can take over, good enough. Now, if secular priests can take over, then we don't have to do it anymore. And I would grant that is a valid principle, but I don't think we've gotten to that point yet. And I've seen so many people who were so impressed by the parish priest that they knew in the town where they were born. It's such a deep impact on people. I do not think we should give up the missions that we have. I mean, by missions, I mean the poor little places in Mindanao where they don't have any money, and where we set up a school which everybody says, well, it's not an Ateneo. All right, it's not an Ateneo, but those kind of schools, they do a tremendous amount of good. When in the history of the world did a country have only one city? But I mean, our leaders don't come only from Manila. And then I really hope that we don't give up retreats, because the impact of retreats is so strong. I mean, I remember some of the retreats that I have given to men, even now. I mean, they remember 30 years later, 40 years later what you said, and they hang on to it, they quote you, and then it's really a principle that has become part of them. So the missions and retreats, and then social work. All right, I know it's a lot of work and it's very hard to measure it. I know it's very, very hard to evaluate what good did Walter Hogan do. I mean, aside from infuriating Cardinal Santos, what else did he do? Well, he did a tremendous amount. He did an awful lot. I mean, Walter was a saint in many, many ways. I would hope that we would not give up social work. And then the schools are all right. That's our leading apostolate at the moment, and it's a real true apostolate. The problem is, the only problem really that I see with the schools is the accent on marks. The accent on marks. Now I match that with money somehow. Money. Marks is what people want, and money is what people want. While they're in school, it's marks. When they get out, it's money. It's the same thing. I wish that we could be separated from both of those things, because the mark, honestly, now this is going to sound like heresy to everybody in the schools, the mark is nothing. Oh, it's nothing. Since when were our best boys the bright ones? Oh boy, some of the brightest boys we've ever had were the ones we were most ashamed of. The boy that we were most ashamed of in World War II was summa cum laude. He was summa cum laude. All right, he got the marks. What difference does that make, you know? I mean, and some of the boys who never graduated are the boys that we were most proud of. I wish that the accent was not on the mark. I really wish that, and that the accent was, and therefore on intellectual prowess, you know, because it's not that. A man is a different thing than just intellectual power. And the first dream is that we don't give up any of our ministries. I know that they feel, well, we're losing manpower, we have to concentrate, we have to centralize, I grant that. But I think that we could do that without giving up the missions that we've had from the beginning. The second thing is, I think that every one of our apostolates should go in for media to the marrow of their bones. Why? Because media is the most powerful force in our world. I think if they get isolated from media, by that I mean radio, television, press, film, just music, the Walkman, the stage. Once we get separated from media, I am afraid we're going to wither and die, because the lifeblood of our whole civilization right now is coming through media. I don't know whether media is forming society or our civilization is forming media. It's probably both. But if we stay with media on all fronts, I don't mean it now as a separate apostolate, not that, but as a tool for every apostolate. That's what I think. I think it should run through everything that we do. Everything that we do. See, as you just said so well, not many people read books anymore. Well, and they don't read newspapers. 15% of our people read newspapers. We're 85% literate in this country, but only 15% read. No, you've got to get the rest of them. They listen, and they listen. They learn with their ears, or they learn with their eyes. That's the way it goes. And all the trouble that the church gets into, they get into because, and not because of verbal, intellectual things. They get into trouble because of the image. See, like Cardinal Sin, my heart goes out to him a little bit, because, not only because I've known him for a long time, but because I think sometimes media really sabotaged him. I mean, he for instance, they accused him of befriending a man who was running for Speaker of the House. Well, that man came and had breakfast with Cardinal Sin. Well, anybody can have breakfast with Cardinal Sin. That's his principle. He doesn't want to lock the door. He wants to be open to everybody. So anybody could have breakfast with Cardinal Sin. So they have breakfast. And they don't even talk about politics, not one word. But coming out, this man tells a funny story, and Cardinal Sin, who is hail fellow, well met, he laughs and puts his arm around him, and at that moment they're coming through the door, and all the photographers, pow! Now you've got got it. 4 colors, full page on the front page. To headline, Sin Pax. This man for Speaker of the House. And then it's the brother of Corey who is running against him, so they say Sin and Corey lock horns. There was no locking of horns. All he did was put his arm around somebody, but it's that image. I mean, that's media. Boy, that's media. You just have to understand the way it works. The way it works and how powerful it is. Nobody reads the newspaper. They just look at the pictures. You know, and you get the right picture in there, you got it. You got it. So that I think, myself, I think the church, isolated individuals in the church understand this, and they're really campaigning for it. And I think there's a groundswell in the church moving that way, I think. But I think we are far, far from appreciating media for what it really can do. And we are far, far from putting men into it. I think that we are poverty-stricken when it comes to media. I mean, everybody who does anything in media does it on his own. He does it because he feels it's important, but he does it without too much help, really, without too much help. You find very, very few men being put into studies to get a doctorate in media, and I don't think that getting a doctorate in media is the way to do it. I think the way to use media is to train somebody in the use of media from the beginning, and media more than anything else you learn by doing. So it's those two things. One, I think that we should keep our multi-facet apostolates in the Philippines. I think that we should. And secondly, I think that each one of the apostolates should use media to the full.
But I just have a couple of questions left. The
Right.
first one is, how would you, given all your experiences, many of them dramatic and very rich, how would you define what it means to be a Jesuit now after so many years in society? What do you think is the heart of our vocation in the society?
It's bringing God to man in the places where nobody else wants to go. I think that's the way it was from the beginning, and that's the way it is now. It's bringing God to man, being a channel of grace in the places and in the activities that are not attractive to the ordinary apostle. I think that's it. I think that's what Loyola was thinking about when he wanted a special vow of obedience to the Holy See. That when the Holy See had something to be done that was not attractive to anybody else, all right, that's when we take it. See, I think that's what it means. See, for instance, our bishops. We're not supposed to take honors in the church, but we do only if it's a place where nobody else wants to be. See, I mean, for instance, Oni Pacana is Bishop of Bukidnon because not many other people want to go to Bukidnon. And we have Tony Ledesma in Ipil because nobody wants to go to Ipil because that's where you get kidnapped by the Muslims. We've got Claver up in Bontoc, Lagawe. Well, he likes it because that's where he was born, but not many people want to go up to Bontoc, Lagawe. So I think it's that way. The mind of Loyola was where it's tough and where normal people don't want to be. That's where we go. Germany with the schools. Well, Germany was eating the priests alive in those days. You know, to go in there and to try to set up a school, that was fierce. To send Xavier to India, well, who wants to go to India? You know, I mean, and then the Society of Jesus sending missionaries into Huron country, you know, into among the Indians. It was always a place where nobody wanted to be. Even the men that really made a mark. See, like Chabanel, Noel Chabanel. We remember him because that's the name of the Chinese language school, but he was a very cultured Frenchman who could not learn the Huron language. He just couldn't get it. And so he took a vow that he would never leave, that he'd stay there. And he stayed. See, I mean, that's the point. Bringing God to men where it's tough, where nobody else wants to go. Marquette, as I hear anyhow, was out of the society for 10 years because he was out in the Indian territory, and they were suffering from a from a plague of some sort, and he had some knowledge of medicine, and he was taking care of them. And when he got orders to come back to St. Louis, he said in conscience, I can't do it. I can't do it. See, I am here and nobody else wants to come here. I got to stay. So he was expelled from the society and was out of the society for 10 years. But finally they reconsidered and took him back. But I think that that's the heart of the Jesuit is do it where it has to be done, and not many other people want to do it. See, right now media is that way. Very few people want to get into media because it's too hard. You get clobbered. You can't be in media without getting clobbered. That's it. You know, and above all, if you want to do anything in media that really counts, if you want to be sweet to everybody, and you know, if you want to be a star, all right. I mean, then it's okay. But I mean, if you really want to use media for the service of God, boy, now that is tough. That is tough. Well, you know, you fight on your knees. I mean, that's the way it goes. So, but I would say it's that way, bringing God to man in the places that are necessary and which are not attractive to anybody else.
Final question, Father. In all these years of your life, what has made you happiest as a Jesuit?
Friendship. Friendship, I think. I mean, the men that I was close to all through. I mean, really good friends. Ed Martin. I don't know, but when you say friendship, well, see, the friends that you made during the war, in a prison camp, you make friendships like nobody else ever knows. I mean, you do. You really get close. I was a good friend of Leo Cullum. Not many men were close to Leo Cullum. Leo Cullum, he was a saint. He had a lot of enemies. Hernando Maceda. But Ed Martin, I mean, what friendship means, I don't know, you understand each other. You accept each other completely, and even if a man has faults, you understand the faults. And he accepts you, and you don't have to pretend with him, and you can say whatever you're thinking without being afraid that he's going to be upset by it. But I came into this house, the main house, one night, and I could hear him calling. I was down on the first floor, and I was just coming through the door, and I could hear Ed's voice. And but nobody else was hearing it, but I did. And I came up 2 flights of stairs to the 3rd floor, and I went into his room, and there he was on the floor, and he was calling for help. He had fallen, and he couldn't get up. So I got him up and got him into bed. This was a couple of weeks before he died. But nobody else could hear that. It's funny. I can't imagine that. Everybody else was in the house, and I was out. But when I came in, I heard him, and nobody else heard him. There were people in the porter's lodge right there. They didn't hear him, but I did. I don't know what this means. I don't know. After Ed died, about 3 days later, I dreamed of Ed, and suddenly I saw him in a red sweatsuit, and looking younger than I'd ever known him. See, we came together in 1938. And I'd never seen him look that young, and in very good physical condition, and he was standing in kind of a hilly territory. Ed was captain of the cross-country team in Manhattan, and their uniform was red. I didn't know him when he was captain of the cross-country team, but when I saw him in that dream, that's what he was. So that matches everything we learn about heaven, you know, that your body will be at its best. I mean, whenever your body was at its best, that's what it'll be in heaven, you know. And he was obviously happy, and I think it's that kind of thing. Ernie Hartnett was my friend. He really was. Hernando Maceda was my friend, boy. Just Diaz is, boy, don't put it on. Just Diaz is dying. He's very tired all the time. But boy, he's a saint also. He really is. We've had so many good men, boy, oh boy. And then Walter Hogan, he was my friend. And then a lot of Bill Rively, the men from the Tony Cummins, the friendship. I think. I mean, you get more in the Society of Jesus. I think that's a reward that they don't talk about much, but I think it's there. I think that if without it you can't survive. You know, what we say is community life. We say community life. I think that word is all right, but it's a pretty cold word. It's a pretty cold word. I think it's really friendship. Well, friendship, I guess the other word is charity, but friendship is better than charity. Because the way they use charity, one man said once he was really angry with somebody else. He had done something, some Jesuit had done something that he didn't like. And he said, from now on, all he's ever going to get from me is the charity of the society. Oh boy, that sounded so terrible. And then somebody wrote me a letter from England saying, it's as cold as charity here. You know, but charity has that connotation, but friendship is different. Friendship it's charity. It's charity the way God meant it to be.
Father, I don't have any more questions, but you may have some more insights or experience you'd like to add, some kind of last word.
The Jesuits who have lived and died in this country have been remarkably good men, and they are not appreciated for what they really were. That's my feeling. I guess that doesn't make any difference. I guess God appreciates them. See, I'm thinking, for instance, Benny Masterson. Wow. All right, they have a building named after Masterson, but when Masterson was taken out of the rectorship of the Ateneo after 3 years, the mother of Sixto Rojas said to me, why was Father Masterson deposed? And I said, well, no, you know, in the Society of Jesus, after you're rector, it doesn't mean you keep going up. I mean, you could go back to rank and file. She said, yes, I know that. But why was he deposed? Well, he was deposed because he bought the Ateneo. That land, which is probably the most brilliant decision made since Magellan sighted Cebu, you know. He bought it at 1 peso a square meter, except some places that were hilly and rolly where it was 50 centavos a square meter. And now, my Lord, it's worth about 30,000 pesos per square meter. Genius. And he's not appreciated. Really not appreciated. De la Costa, I think, is appreciated, but pretty soon nobody's going to remember De la Costa. Mulry was appreciated by all of the students, but now his students are gone, and now nobody even remembers Joe Mulry. You know, he's a room in the Ateneo. That's it, a Mulry room. They don't even know who he was. And Hernando Maceda, he was truly a saint. Really, we all suffered from his sanctity. Well, nobody is good. Nobody remembers Maceda. But I think somehow we have a glorious history here which is not recorded. And I would guess it's just never going to be recorded. That's what I would guess. So that when they asked me if I would do this book on Wilman, you know, the only reason I did the book on Wilman is suddenly you had a group of men who were going to do it. I mean, they were going to do it. If you write a book on somebody else, you might never even get it printed. But here they wanted it printed, and they were going to help, and they were going to give me the material and everything else. So I moved heaven and earth to do that, and I'm glad that I did it. But see, we don't have records of the other guys, you know. John F. Hurley, oh boy. I better stop here. But John F. Hurley standing in the doorway of the Ateneo classroom in 1942, because inside that classroom there was an American woman with a Filipina maid, and a Japanese lieutenant wanted that Filipina maid, and Hurley would not move. So the Japanese slapped him and then continued slapping him. Right, forward, back, forward, back, forward, back. Then he took his sword and began to beat him with the sword. And Hurley never moved. He never lifted his hands. You know, boy, that was heroism like you never saw. And Hurley's dead. Now nobody's going to remember Hurley, you know. But we've had so many remarkably good men like that, you know, so that I guess it's not a tragedy, but it's what I'm saying is the Society of Jesus has really been a gold mine of good men, really good men, who came here and gave their lives quietly and disappeared. That's it. It's like what it says in the Old Testament, we're like a bird that flies from the east to the west, and it cleaves the light air and it passes through, but when it is gone, there is no mark in the sky to show which way it went. I think that's the way it is with many Jesuits. I don't know what to do about that. I guess it's impossible for us really to record anything. So what you are trying to do, I appreciate. I think that's very, very good. I think if we could record, see, that's what Horacio tried to do in his History of the Society of Jesus. He did try to reclaim some of the big men as best he could, Thank you very much, Father. That was okay.
Thank you for your time.